Ever since Kaiju 8 started airing, I was waiting for it to come through with a major action episode, and episode 9 was just that. Kinda. Look, there aren't that many shows I can make animation breakdowns about this season. Let me have this one. The staff list for this episode was bizarre. On one hand, the key animator list was stacked, featuring names like Itsuki Tsuchigami, Kazuto Arai, Ryota Furukawa, Atsushi Ikaria, and more. But on the other hand, we had 4 different episode directors and 3 assistant episode directors. I wonder what happened there. The storyboards were drawn by Ryota Furukawa. He has done storyboard work for projects like Heavenly Delusion and the second Fate Camelot movie in the past. All things considered, the staff list was strong and the final product was quite good, with a few incredible highlights. Right off the bat, the show did an excellent job of setting the stage. The 3D background aided camera work here looks amazing. The night being lit up by the fire looked really good. It's a simple idea, but the compositing team did an excellent job of executing it. I have no idea how they created this shot. I might be missing something basic, but surely this isn't a zoom into a single background, right? Pretty sure it's not 3D either. My best guess is that they transitioned to a different, similar looking background using the clouds as the transition point. Love the aggressive camera shakes, by the way. We then got a bunch of excellent explosions. All of them were animated by Kazuto Arai, and they were so good. The level of detail was high. The explosions had complicated structures, meaning the number of clouds or curves were quite high. That's particularly impressive given the sheer number of explosions. Shots like these, which are framed from the point of view of a bystander, really sell the scale. The low-angle shots make the scene feel larger than life. The kaijus in this episode were all 2D, except for a few wide shots, which will never not be impressive. More amazing effects animation by Kazuto Arai, which isn't surprising because his effects work is pure eye candy. Setting that one JJK episode where he drew an absurd amount of layouts aside, most of Arai's best works lean towards the effects animation side of things. The screen was really busy around this section. We had the heatwave effect added by the comp team, the fire, and the smoke, most of which was digital. These establishing shots were hard to see, but in a good way. A tiny nitpick: the camera work here is off-putting. The backwards motion looks fine, but this part looked awkward. The speed at which the camera moves away from the kaiju's leg is out of sync with the speed at which the camera moves away from the ground. The road moves forward too quickly. Again, it doesn't really matter. I like the kaiju's design and the drawings were great, but it looks flat because of the one-note color design. I don't remember if he was this way in the manga, in a color page that is, but the near complete lack of color contrast makes it difficult to appreciate the drawing quality. The storyboard work here was great. Usually, multiple cuts for a single strike take away from the impact, but the energy was well conserved here. Also, look how volumetric this drawing is. Minimal line work, but it feels 3D. Not 3D as in CGI, 3D as in depth. This sequence was animated by Atsushi Ikaria, and the kaiju drawings were top-notch. Look at the amount of line work here. The blur makes it difficult to see, but I'm fairly certain that the detail you see here is drawn by him. Also, background animation. An exaggerated pose here, with the chest to waist ratio not making much sense, but on purpose, to build up the anticipation for the strike. Also, these lines on the fist further add to the impact. I'm not a fan of these long, trailing, blurred smears they use to convey the strike paths. I think they take away from the snappiness of the motion. Ikaria conveyed movement through a series of static impact frames. There is a major difference between the pose just before the impact frames and the pose after it. The idea is to convey a complicated series of actions through a small handful of impact frames instead of actual movement which sells Hoshina's speed. Also, a slow motion shot of the kaiju at an unorthodox angle. All 3 of those things are really impressive. We then get several minutes of above average action. No point in going through all of it. Positives include the 2D kaijus and this dense, multi-layered Dutch angle shot, and negatives include the wonky perspective here and the over-reliance on speed lines. Although I will say this, at no point was the action static. Not all of it stood out, but the movement was there, and the general drawing quality was solid. The exchange of strikes here looked quite weak. The scene was somewhat choppy and they didn't do much to sell the weight of these punches, despite Hoshina's statement of them being strong enough to kill him in one hit. There There is very little anticipation and no extra wind effects, so the punches feel normal. Also, the composition is wonky. The kaiju's head is cropped out for most of this cut and a chunk of the action is asymmetric, which leads me to believe that they zoomed into this scene more than they wanted to. Compare those weak-looking punches to this one. Several frames of build-up followed by an instantaneous release. They didn't even add a smear. That plus the wind effects made the hit feel heavy. I like these alternating speed lines around the outline of the character. They are added by the photography team and they get the energy across. Some standard bits of action later, we reach the animation highlight of this episode, some of which was animated by Itsuki Tsuchigami, presumably. We don't actually see Hoshina slice the kaiju in this cut, we see the aftermath. The camera pans in the direction of the slice after the fact, and this delayed movement highlights how fast he is. Excellent weight control here. You can feel the energy shift from one shoulder to another through the chest and then to the fist. The kaiju drawings were solid throughout this episode, but this cut was particularly impressive. Why? Because while the kaiju is humanoid, it contains a bunch of organic shapes. These spikes, for example. Also, the line count on it is really high, and all of this detail needs to remain consistent as the angle changes. If it doesn't, the scene will melt. With that in mind, look how consistent the drawings are here. We barely get to see the physical act of Hoshina swinging his blade. We usually get the aftermath. Again, this conveys how fast he is. In this case, we get a single impact frame that conveys the motion. The drawings here look really good, which leads me to believe that this scene might be Tsuchigami's. This exchange was fine. They didn't really do much to distinguish between the kaiju's power and Hoshina's speed. The scene moves at a uniform pace. Although I do appreciate how long it is, continuous action is not easy to animate. The sequence that follows is incredible. We get some wonderful perspective work on the fist, followed by a few impact frames. And yet again, we don't see Hoshina use his blade. We see the sliced up hand instead, which then quickly zooms in, pans to the side and zooms out. The idea is to convey a quick, snappy motion, and that's exactly what this sequence does. Not through raw animation, but rather through clever cuts and camera work. A similar thing happens in the sequence that follows. Also, the pillar and the ground here is hand animated, although the ground is mostly blurred. In this shot, we see Hoshina move past the kaiju, and then his actions catch up to him in the form of a long impact frame sequence after the fact. This episode basically used delayed movement, impact frames and camera work to convey his speed, and this cut was the most extreme example of the same. Some possible morphing animation brought us to the end. This episode looked great. Was it the best looking thing ever? No. Was it a bit of a letdown given the stuff? Maybe, but it was a massive step up from the previous few episodes. Excited to see what this show comes up with. That's about it. Liked the video? Check out this other bit of content on screen. Like and subscribe, and until next time.